Colin Seal, founder and CEO of thinkLaw, and we are looking at lesson 12, the Fox and the Ball part 2. Now you should have already completed part 1 of this lesson, which walks you through the draw plus C framework for the Fox case. So in this case, we are actually looking at a case involving some multimedia, which you can tell by that little TV that we see. We start out with a think starter, which introduced an interesting concept, again, about property ownership, how and when something becomes yours. I found that it was really helpful when teachers do this activity to create a chart where you have all the 5 boys that are listed, and you break it up as like, the first boy that touch it, the oldest boy, the youngest boy, and the 2 others, and figure out who has the best claim to the sock and what's in the sock and why. Very interesting probing questions in this case, such as, the sock ended up having a whole bunch of money in it, but clearly, probably folks wouldn't have wanted the sock if all it was a dirty sock and rags in it. So coming up with the best arguments, figuring out who should get it is very interesting. And ultimately, what happened in this case was the court couldn't find a way to identify one of these folks that both had a property right in it, and so they wanted it, and they had some sort of control over the item. Either they had control over it, but it wasn't really clear that they wanted it, or they wanted it but didn't have control over it once it was all said and done and the sock broke. So because they couldn't find one of the 5 that deserved it, they broke it up into all 5 of them. Which brings us to a really interesting case, and it's actually one of my favorite cases in Think Law, one of my favorite cases actually in the whole world, which involves uh, Barry Bonds. Real life case that happened where Barry Bonds broke the single season home run record and a huge fight ensued. And we have this all on our video that you can see on from there's several different YouTube clips about this. I included one in the PowerPoint, but you can see the brouhaha that ensued when this ball hit the stands. And now there's this fight between Alex Popoff and Patrick Hibachi about who actually owns this ball. So we're using the same concept from the Fox case. How and when does something become yours? And we're actually walking through the draw plus C process here as we're going through it. So the cool part about this case is, we go through it and the students talk about what happened here, and they analyze who should win based off of their analysis. What's cool about this is we often think about a lot of our arguments as, okay, either you win or the other person wins. But this is an interesting case because there are other options beyond just I win or you win. Going back to our in the neighborhood case where we had the settlement, there's ways where both folks can end up winning. And that did not happen in this case. In this case, as you'll discuss at the end of it, everyone lost except for the attorneys. Why did they lose? Because the court really couldn't decide from a public policy standpoint whether you should say the ball would go to Mr. Hayashi, because in that case, what we're saying is if the ball went into the stands, you could just knock people out, and the last person that had the ball would be the person that would get it. How would that work at a baseball game where senior citizens are in attendance and, little children go to attend? It just wouldn't be a tenable solution. So the court also found that it really wasn't the other guy's fault either, because he fell on the floor and he picked it up. He didn't seem to do anything wrong, but we didn't really want to find a rule that was going to encourage that sort of behavior at baseball games. So the court decided to force these folks to split the ball and not give it to anybody. They basically had to sell it and split the profit. The problem was, by that time, we already knew Barry Bonds had been accused of steroids. This was probably 5 years after the fact, so initially, the ball could have went for about $1.5 million. Had they made the decision to split those funds at the very beginning, they each probably would have had more money than they ever saw in their lives. Instead, they couldn't even pay back the legal fees. One of the defendants, one of these guys actually went bankrupt because they couldn't pay back this money to the attorney. So it kind of shows the bigger picture of, what would have happened if instead of fighting this big fight, they actually worked together to figure out a way they can resolve their conflict without going this route. So it's very interesting. You can watch the video and really push them on being very specific and intentional about their analysis. At this point, they should be developing a real comfort on the Draw Plus C framework. And if they need any tips on it, they can always go back to lesson 11 and review what we wrote out as the Draw Plus C framework in that lesson. Thank you. That is the end of lesson 12, and now we're going to go on to lesson 13.